And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Terry Smith, the this year's board president, and it's been a year of change for us all. So we appreciate you joining us online and helping us navigate this new online experience. Today we are joined by a number of experienced folks on the topic of election reform, and we are interested to hear their viewpoints on, does Alaska need election reform? Our first speaker has recently published a book, and so I'm really excited to get her vantage point on it. This November, Alaskans will consider a ballot initiative that would make sweeping changes in Alaska's electoral processes. As a nonpartisan public policy forum, Commonwealth North takes no position on this matter. Today's program is offered as a means to engage in civic dialogue on the topic of elections reform and consider the potential impacts of ballot measure 2. It is up to you, the audience, and voters across Alaska to determine your position on this matter. We are pleased to welcome several guest speakers. Our keynote speaker is Katherine Gehl, co-author of the recently published book, The Politics of Industry: How Political Innovation Can Break Partisan Gridlock and Save Our Democracy. Katherine is a business owner and national speaker who advocates for restoring competition in American politics. Following her remarks, we'll hear an analysis and discussion about the election reform initiative from Alaskan attorneys Scott Kendall and Chad Hutchison. Before we hand the program over to our panel, I'd like to thank the Commonwealth North members who are online with us for your membership and the tremendous work you've done to help educate Alaskans, including our policy leaders, on Alaska's public policy challenges. I'd also like to invite the rest of you to join Commonwealth North and support our mission. We have a number of very interesting study groups that are in place right now, and they welcome your participation and your experience. Now we will hear from our speakers, beginning with Katherine. Katherine, the floor is yours.
I think you couldn't hear me.
Go, good.
Okay. So again, thank you, Terry. Thank you, Winetta. I am so happy to be here with all of you. Of course, the only thing that would make me happier is if I were in Alaska, which 5 years ago is the first trip I took after I sold my business. So I have wonderful memories of your gorgeous state. Okay, so here's the thing. I know Commonwealth North doesn't have positions as is appropriate on this ballot measure, but as you might imagine, I do. So I'm going to talk today about why the country needs election reform, or as I call it, election innovation. And then you'll hear from Scott and Chad about specifically what you guys have the opportunity to do in Alaska very quickly. So let's start with something that might not seem directly related to politics. And I can't see you, but I really appreciate it if you would all participate. And I can see a couple of you. So Terry, this counts you. So how many people here drink beer or wine? Put your hand up if you drink beer or wine. And how many people are, and keep your hands up if you are in general pretty darn satisfied with your choices in the marketplace of beer or wine? Okay, pretty good. Oh, Winetta's got two. Okay, and now let's keep our hands up if we vote, and keep our hands up if you are in general pretty darn satisfied consistently with all the choices you have in the ballot box. And good, we see Terry is very satisfied, and Meade, and we see some of us are not. From asking this question around the country, I find that in general, most hands go down when we ask if people are satisfied. And this really begs the question, why in America do we have over 6,000 breweries and 3,000 wineries, and yet when it comes to our politics, we get two choices? And the answer is that unlike in the beer and wine industry, in the politics industry, we don't have innovation, results, and accountability, the best of what healthy competition would provide, the best of what I like to call free market politics. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about how we can get from the current state of gridlock and dysfunction to the desired state of results and accountability. And I want to start with one of the few things about which so many people across the ideological spectrum do agree on, and that is Washington is broken. We hear that all the time, but it turns out that this idea actually represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. The truth is that Washington isn't broken, it's doing exactly what it's designed to do. But the confusion that we have is thinking that every piece of the system has been designed with the aim of solving problems and advancing the public interest. But in fact, as is the case in any industry where participants in the industry can control the rules of the industry, it turns out that most of the incentives that drive behavior in politics have been created and optimized by and for the benefit of two totally rational, gain-seeking organizations, which are two political parties plus their industry allies, which together comprise what we call the political industrial complex. And right now, the political industrial complex is thriving, and yet the American public has never been more dissatisfied. There's a disconnect. We have a systems problem. The problem is the current design, not the constitutional part, but the day-to-day part. So let's illustrate that key design flaw with a Venn diagram. Currently, the way our elections are run, there's virtually no intersection between Congress acting in the public interest and the likelihood that they will get reelected. In other words, if America's elected representatives do their jobs the way we want and need them to, they're likely to lose those jobs. And that is a crazy design. I mean, we'd never do that in our businesses. But fortunately, we can fix this. Our system is missing two critical dimensions of any well-functioning industry or business. Again, we don't get results, and there's no accountability in the system for that. And that's because we have two major structural problems with our voting system design. First, we have party primaries. Most elections today are really decided in the primary, 80% of congressional elections. And that's where candidates are polled further to the right or to the left than voters as a whole really want. But far more pernicious is that the influence of the party primary actually extends to governing. And party primaries are the single greatest structural reason why the single greatest structural contributor to the gridlock and the results that we aren't seeing out of Washington, D.C. So imagine yourself as for a moment as one of the federal politicians. It's not just what you have to say to get elected. It's now you're in office and you have an opportunity to sign a sort of landmark bill on one of our nation's biggest challenges. And this would be a bipartisan, negotiated, compromise solution on, let's say, national debt, infrastructure, healthcare. What are the operative questions that you ask yourself? Is this a good idea? Is this the right policy for the country? Is this what the majority of my constituents want? Well, it's actually none of those. The question that you need to ask as the elected official is, will I make it back through my party primary if I vote for this? And if the answer to that question is no, and on all the big issues, it pretty much always is for both sides, then the answers to the important other questions are sort of fundamentally irrelevant, because the rational incentive to get reelected dictates that you vote no. Because if you vote yes, you're going to have a primary challenger. Party primaries create an eye of the needle problem through which no problem-solving politician can pass. Now, the other reason why we don't get results is because there's really zero accountability for not getting results. The reason for that is because the customer, the voter, only has two choices. So in any other industry as big and as thriving as the politics industry, with this much customer dissatisfaction and only two players, some entrepreneur would see it as a phenomenal business opportunity, and they would create a new competitor responding to what the customers wanted. But that doesn't happen in politics because the barriers to entry are astronomically high. And the single greatest barrier is actually structural. It's not money, for example. It's how we vote. Specifically, plurality voting, which is something I certainly never thought about until a few years ago. But let me explain. So when our country was young, being founded, there really weren't examples, of course, of enduring and successful democracies. So our leaders copied the only electoral system in existence at the time, and it was the way they elected some offices in the country in Britain. And so we went with plurality voting, which means whoever has the most votes wins. Now that seems totally rational, and yet it turns out that what happens is the most votes win. You don't really need it. You don't need a true majority. You don't need over 50%. So in any election with more than two candidates, someone can win with substantively under majority support. For example, in a three-way race, candidate could win with 34%. And the other two candidates split this other 66% between them, which means 66% of the voters actually preferred someone other than the winner. Now that might not seem fair or representative, but the real thing we need to be concerned about when we think about the incentives is that this plurality voting has an unexpected consequence. Plurality voting eliminates any threat of substantive competition to what we call the duopoly, the two existing players, because it creates the spoiler effect and the wasted vote. Here's how that works. Sometimes we don't vote for the candidate we might really want out of fear that we would be wasting our vote, or we would be spoiling the election for the candidate that we like the most, and accidentally help elect the candidate we like the least. So, but far more often than that we don't vote for one of the candidates we really want is that it stops candidates from running in the first place. You might recall back in the spring of 2019, the widely admired former CEO and founder of Starbucks, Howard Schultz, considered running as an independent for president. And when he announced this possibility, the reaction from Democrats was really vicious, because Democrats believed that he was more similar to a Democrat, and that if he ran as an independent, he would spoil the election for the eventual Democratic nominee. And so they didn't want that to happen in the race. And that would certainly happen on the other side if there was such a potential substantive candidate on the right. That's precisely the kind of problem that plurality voting creates. Now, for the purpose of thinking about this, it doesn't matter if you think Howard Schultz or any other candidate would have made the best president or not. We can all still understand that there's something fundamentally unhealthy about a system where having more talented, passionate competitors is somehow bad. So if you think about it, politics is the only industry where we're regularly told that less competition is better for the customer. And that shouldn't be, and it doesn't have to be. The election innovation that I propose in my book, called Final Four voting, or in my book I generally talk about Final Five voting, but Final Four is what we're going to go for in Alaska. So I'm excited about that. It solves both these problems. We need to make two changes in how we vote, one in the primary and one in the general. First, let's get rid of the party primary system. We don't need to have it work that way. Let's change to open top four primaries. When you would vote in the primary, there'll be only one ballot, and all the candidates, regardless of party, run on that ballot. And then the top four finishers advance to the general election. Top 4 primaries eliminate the eye of the needle primary problem and thus allow legislators the freedom to legislate in the public interest and to work across the aisle collaboratively. Second, in the general election, let's get rid of plurality voting, and instead we can use ranked choice voting. And I'll explain how that works. Assume that we've come to the end of what is now a dynamic and diverse primary competition between 4 candidates and 4 sets of ideas and visions and innovation. Now with ranked choice voting, we get to indicate our preferences in order, just the way we do for sort of our ice cream flavors or the pizza toppings that we want. Think of it as something like this, and we'll see a diagram here. Yes. So this says that, oh, my first candidate, you know, that's obviously my favorite. That's the one I want, all the way down to my 4th choice is something akin to, you know, over my dead body, do I really want that person to be my representative? And you just tick them off in order. Here's how it looks in the voting booth itself. It's a simple grid. And here we have the founding fathers. Now, in this case, Alexander Hamilton was my first choice because I love the musical. And John Adams here is last for me. Now the polls close. The first place votes alone are counted. And if out of those 4, one of them has a true majority over 50%, the election's over. That candidate wins. However, if they have split the vote and nobody has a true majority, then we move into instant runoff. Drop the candidate who's in last place. And if you had selected the candidate who's now been eliminated, your vote is now counted for your second choice. Now we run the totals again, and we continue doing that. There could be one more round until we result with the winner being the candidate with the broadest support among the most number of voters. And that's a great benefit, but the most important benefit of RCV is that by doing that, it eliminates the greatest barrier to new competition that we just talked about, which is none of the new candidates or the different candidates or the additional candidates over the usual 2 are spoilers or wasted votes. We can really express our preferences and people can put themselves up for, you know, election. Now, you guys have had some independents run successfully in Alaska. That's highly unusual in other states. So remember our initial Venn diagram. Let's quickly go back to it and revisit it with our solution. Under our new system, Final 4 voting, politicians are incented to solve problems, and they're incented to do what we as a country need them to do. Now, that same legislator who's considering the bipartisan legislation on you know, some landmark problem can vote yes. They can say to themselves, you know, this isn't exactly what my side wants, but it's really a great agreement to move the country forward. And under the old system, I never would have made it back through my party primary if I voted for this. But under the new system, I'm sure I can be in the top 4. And then in the general election, with the much higher turnout and the broad cross-section of voters, with a combination of first and second place votes, I'll be able to craft a win. This system, free market politics, realigns the incentives. And if we implement it, we'll get results and accountability. And we can achieve this in years, not decades. We don't need all 50 states to make a difference. A small number of states, let's say 5, sending 2 senators each to Washington, D.C. gives us 10 senators who will come with their ideologies absolutely and as they should, but they have freedom to work together and address trade-offs because they are not captive to only staying as far apart as our current election system forces them to do. Now, Alaska is leading the way on this. Article 1 of our Constitution says the states make the rules for our federal elections. So every state can and must change these rules individually. So that's what, you guys are going to talk about here, and your experts, of course, are going to be Scott and Chad, who will take your questions in a moment. But before I turn it over to them, just one more thing. If this healthy competition for ideas, not just candidates, but ideas and innovation and policies sounds good to you, then the campaign needs you. Needs you to join, needs you to tell people about it, needs you to vote yes, needs you to fund. That's how we'll get it over the finish line. Historically, the United States political system was a critical foundation of our success, but now it stands in the way of virtually every important issue that we need to address, and it doesn't have to be this way. When I watch the election results in November, I will be watching Alaska, and I will be sort of on the edge of my seat to see what you and your fellow citizens decide. And I suspect that it will make me optimistic about the future, because when people hear about more voice, more choice, and better results, they're usually in. And for that reason, I'm starting to call Alaska the other swing state, as in the longer term future of our democracy. What direction are we going to swing? So please get involved if you're not already, and I will do whatever I can to support you. And again, I'll be cheering you on in November. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Katherine. Now we'll turn our discussion to ballot measure 2. On November 3rd, the question before Alaska voters is, in simplest terms, shall we, 1, have an open nonpartisan primary where the top 4 vote getters advance to the general election? 2, have a ranked choice general election where voters have the option to rank their choices from 1 to 4. And 3, require additional disclosures for contributions to independent expenditure groups, the sources of those contributions, and require a disclaimer on paid election communications by independent expenditure groups funded by a majority of out-of-state money. The question today, as it will be on November 3rd, shall this initiative become law? With us today are Alaska attorneys Chad Hutchison and Scott Kendall, each of whom has 5 minutes for an opening statement. Following those statements, we will turn to audience questions. Scott, you're up.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Katherine. That was a great introduction and leaves me with less to explain. So important, I think, to start with why. Not just what are we doing with ballot measure 2, but why are we doing it? So statement of the problem. First of all, partisan gridlock. Juneau is non-responsive because this current system makes it difficult to be responsive. 6 years into a fiscal crisis, and yet solutions seem further away than ever. Statesmanship, bipartisanship are punished in our current system. This isn't a hypothetical anymore. Our recent primaries, I think, showed us something. We had fairly popular incumbents who appeared to be doing the will of most of their constituents, who are focused on results, not rhetoric, were punished for it. And they were punished for it, but it's important to peel back the numbers. We had these popular incumbents lose, and I'm not going to get into details except for one detail. For most of these incumbents who have just lost last Tuesday, or it appears may lose based on the results to date, approximately 10% of their constituents voted against them. 10% of their constituents decided, you're out. The 10% of the most extreme or most partisan constituents in a district have now decided for the other 90%, you don't have a choice. Because by and large, these districts, of course, are often safe for one party or the other. So whoever wins that primary is likely the shoe-in to win. And with this low turnout, closed primaries, again, 10% have decided, you were out there and I saw you, you smiled at someone from the other party once. So you're out, you're not pure enough. And that's part of the problem. Retribution for doing the things we would actually expect and hope that our public officials do. That's problem 2. Third part of the problem, dark money, secret money, especially in a low population state like Alaska with a lot on the line nationally, secret money courses through our elections. not only are people attempting to influence our vote, we don't know who they are. We don't know where the money comes from. And by the time we find out, it's too late. So the solution, ballot measure 2. First of all, a ban on dark money. We can't, under Citizens United, prohibit corporate spending or large independent spending, but what Citizens United still allows us to do is force disclosure. Right now, because of Citizens United, 10 years ago, our disclosure requirements in Alaska and many states were left in tatters. This would put us back at the forefront. It would say, you can bring your money to Alaska, but the moment it comes here, we're going to know your name. Want to impact our elections? You can't funnel your money through 2 or 3 intermediaries. We will know who you are influencing our elections. That's solution number 1. Solution 2 is open primaries, 1 ballot. Every candidate on the ballot. You want to select a Democrat in the US Senate race, you want to select a Republican in the governor's race, you can do that because Alaskans, 62% of us don't affiliate with either party. The final 4 finishers, the top 4, move on to the general election. So in the case of last Tuesday, those popular incumbents who are doing the will of their constituents by and large are going to make it to the general election ballot. And the general election populace is going to have that chance to support or not support the solutions that they put forward. Part 3 is ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting. That means you get to rank your choices and no more spoiler effect. As Katherine explained so well, I won't go into a lot of depth, but imagine a hypothetical race where you have perhaps 1 very extreme candidate and 2 candidates who share a lot in common. 65% of the voters split their vote over here between these 2 candidates. The remaining voters all consolidate behind the extreme candidate. Under the current system, you can have someone win who 66% of the state don't want. And I would ask, ask yourself as a voter, if you cast a ballot and your person is in 3rd place, would you want the ability to have some say in what happens with the other 2? I think you would. And we trust the voters, and we want to give that power to the voters. And with that, I'll let it go to Chad. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And I appreciate the statements made so far. I just want to note a couple things. Number 1, the absentees are still coming in, and some of the candidates that maybe you would consider to be more moderate have changed position as to what it was even a week ago. And number 2, I've heard the word gridlock a few times. Gridlock, in many ways, there's a famous quote that I think of, is the voters' affirmation that they support the status quo. They don't necessarily want drastic changes immediately. So from my perspective, as I look at ballot measure 2, I have a couple concerns, and there's a couple challenges that I think people need to ponder. And I think of both the procedure upon which this is going forward and substantively under the Alaska Constitution. Generally, I do not believe that direct democracy citizen initiatives are the best way to address some of the changes we're talking about. And we're going to be focused on changing fundamental rights, including the right to vote, the right to political speech, including restricting political speech and political assembly. I think about James Madison, who wrote the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and he wanted a deliberative process. He creates separation of powers, a legislature with 2 houses where they have committees, where they have expert opinion, they have the equivalent of cross-examination to determine if a policy is wise policy. And with the initiative process, we're not necessarily going through that same process, and that's a problem. This initiative right now is 25 pages long. It's got 74 different sections. It's one of the largest initiatives to be presented volume-wise to the state of Alaska. It's got complex issues. I think about the Stand for Salmon initiative we had a couple years ago. That too was very complex. It really dealt with anadromous fish biology and adjacent land management. And just submitting that to an up or down vote on all those different issues, I think there's a better way to do it, and we have it already set up in our system. And there's a criticism that, well, the legislature wouldn't necessarily want to take this up because the legislature is going to be directly affected, the parties will be directly affected. But I think about 2017 with Representative Gren, there was a legislative ethics initiative that he was proposing, and the legislature took that up in 2018 and passed a substantially similar measure. So the legislature has shown an appetite to take on what may be considered difficult issues. So there's a number of constitutional concerns that I see as I review through the initiative, and I think about the Alaska Constitution, which has more protection, more individual liberty. The Alaska Supreme Court has been very definitive as to that. So there's more protections that are provided under the Alaska Constitution than even the U.S. Constitution. That's considered the foundation, and there's more protection under the Alaska Constitution. I'm looking at Section 1 of the initiative, and I've heard about Citizens United. But to be fair, Citizens United also says that First Amendment standards must give the benefit of any doubt to protecting rather than stifling speech. That's number one. And number two, they say that First Amendment has its fullest and most urgent application to speech uttered during a campaign for political office. That's the Supreme Court's analysis and decision based on the U.S. Constitution. As stated before, the Alaska Constitution provides more protection. If you look at Article 1, Katherine mentioned it, that's our version of the Bill of Rights. Section 5, every person may freely speak, write, and publish on all subjects, being responsible for that abuse of that right. And some provisions of the ballot initiative, including in Section 1 and many others, we're going in the opposite direction. We're actually creating more restrictions. And before my time's up, I just want to say Section 6, the right to peaceful assembly. The political parties have brought this up in committee hearings in the House. That's an outstanding issue, and there's dissenting opinion in some of the cited cases during the House explanation process that talk about whether there is a violation of a party's right to assemble. And then in Section 22, one of the most important things that the Alaska Constitution has in Article 1 is the right to privacy. And here we're talking about confidentiality and disclosures. And they may or may not be great ideas, but I think that there should be a thorough vetted analysis through a legislative process where you can have the ability for the public to weigh in, expert testimony to understand if this is truly in our best interest or not. At the end of the day, if there's fundamental rights affected, in some cases, especially with speech, you're looking at a strict scrutiny analysis where it has to be, if there is restrictions, it's necessary to compelling state interest, and it has to be the least restrictive alternative. Are some of the provisions in the initiative, as it stands now, truly the least restrictive alternative? So that's my opening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Very good, thank you. Chad and Scott, it was very informative. Appreciate your thoughts. Juanetta, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, indeed we do, Terry. Thank you very much to our speakers. Let's start with a few basic questions. And we'll try and moderate the time between the respondents, but let's start with this question about, particularly as we've seen with recent elections and as we anticipate moving forward, that there's a substantial number of mailed-in ballots and absentee ballots that take some time to count. And so how do you anticipate that any kind of election reforms might impact absentee and mail-in voting and the delayed response time with which would be required to count all of those votes? Do you want to try that first, Scott?
Yeah, please. Thank you. So the answer is Alaska has a lot of challenges, our geography, mailing of ballots, and so forth. But in terms of ranked choice voting causing any delay, the answer to that is zero. Our current voting machines that were newly purchased can actually tabulate ranked choice ballots. They need a software update, but the answer is once you have all the ballots together and they run through the machine, every stage of the tabulation is documented, but that would happen just as quickly as what we have today. The barriers to quick results are, as we all know, the literal physical moving of the ballots from where they are to where they need to be tabulated. So no delay.
Any thoughts on that, Chad?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And normally under a legislative process, you'd have the Division of Elections come in and answer that and see what the effect is. I'm not ready to say whether there's going to be no delay or a delay because I don't know what Division of Elections would necessarily testify to on that answer, on that question, excuse me.
Okay. Well, another question that seems to be on people's minds is that obviously this kind of broad change to the electoral process will require some voter education, and particularly just not only how the process works, but how to mark their ballots. And so what can be done, or what could be done if these changes were implemented to ensure the public's awareness of what their options are, or is it an impossible task? So let's start, I think, with Chad, maybe if we can start with you on this one.
Well, I will agree with the premise that there will be an education process, and what that's going to look like, it's again a great question, which is one of the issues that I generally have with having to do these drastic changes in an initiative process, is that those are something that the experts should be able to come in and testify to. There should be some public testimony to see what the appetite is, and that's my starting presumption for that type of question.
Okay. And Scott?
Yeah, that is a really great question. And fortunately, in response to the ballot measure, the Division of Elections has indicated that they will pass the necessary regulations, and they will have a budget for voter education. They're going to have 2 years to educate voters. And what they will do is, your voter pamphlet will show what a ranked choice ballot looks like, which you just saw when Katherine was speaking. And as you're in the voting booth, you're going to have, just as you have now, visual directions that say, hey, fill in your bubble and fill it in dark. It's going to show what a ballot is. It's going to have a synopsis. The beauty of it is we don't have to guess. Maine has done this. They've done it statewide now for several cycles. I think 3 cycles now, the state of Maine has done ranked choice voting. And what they have seen is successful voting by the electorate has been on par with voting by the earlier conventional means. People see it and it's intuitive. You can under our ballot measure vote for just one person and your vote counts exactly like it is now and you can walk away. But saying, after these other 2 candidates, I do have a preference between them. It's intuitive. And it's something you do every day, whether it's on a Yelp review, whether you go to a restaurant and you say, I'd like the filet mignon. Oh, we're out of that. Do you say, well, I'm not going to eat then? Or do you let your neighbor order? Or do you say, okay, well, I'll have the ribeye? I mean, it really is not quite the challenge I think people indicate. We trust voters, and voters, we strongly believe, aren't going to have an issue with it. And we've got a decade of jurisdictions who have had successful voting, and the state of Maine. Satisfaction is sky high. The legislature has attempted to claw back the ranked choice voting system, and the people by referendum in Maine have said, no, we love it and we want to keep it.
All right. Well, we have a question, I think, that is probably much on people's minds, and that is, well, let's say how it's, can you reconcile Arrow's impossibility theorem in social choice theory with the support of ranked choice voting? Because the theorem states that every system can be gamed. So how does ranked choice voting square with electoral security and people's concerns that obviously have been growing, that our system can be gamed at even today? So let's start with Scott on this one.
Thank you, Juanetta. So kind of 2 issues there, and I'll take them both in order. I appreciate that you thought I might be aware of that theorem, and I'm afraid I'm not quite well read enough, but I do understand the question. The idea being the system's gamed. The system's gamed right now. The system is fixed and it's working exactly the way it's meant to. Right now, one of the 2 parties wins. Worse still, in any sort of close legislative district, I can go and have someone file independent or file anchor Alaska Independence Party, be a spoiler, and assure that seat goes to one party or the other. The system is gamed. The new system, ranked choice voting, who's gaming the system? The voters by having more choice, more preference? No one's gaming it. You're giving more power to the voters. They'll use it or they won't. But if you're ending up with a result, as we've seen in ranked choice voting, is the public officials elected through that system tend to have 60+% support from the overall electorate because more people had a hand in electing them. If that's gaming the system, sign me up. That's not gaming the system. That's more choice and more power for the voters. The second issue, security, bears some explanation. because Alaska, as I knew for working for Governor Walker and I was on an elections work group, Alaska has one of the safest election systems in the country. One of the rare things that we're in the top 2 or 3 on, because we have the sanctity of the paper ballot. And nothing in this ballot measure changes that. In fact, it preserves it. So those ballots are forever going to be a paper record of the election results. And a recount, although people think this goes into a big black box and you have to, somehow a computer spits out the result, it's really not that complicated. I actually had to do it by hand to understand it. But imagine you have, 10 votes and 3 candidates, only 10 voters. With the first tabulation, you just stack the votes by voter. So one has 2, one has 5, one has 3. And no one's gone over 50%. The only thing you do in a recount is you take the stack that's number 2, you pick them up and you go, okay, what's their second choice? And then you put them in that stack. That's it. So it's as secure as could be because Alaska has the most secure elections in the country and we're not going to change that. And it can't be gamed except we're giving the voters just a little more choice and a little more control and maybe taking it a little bit away from the parties and giving it to the 62% of Alaskans who don't affiliate.
Okay. Chad, any thoughts?
Yeah, so as far as gaming the system, that's actually referenced. There's a case called Dundon versus Arntz in 2011. It came out of the Ninth Circuit, takes place in San Francisco. And the court actually acknowledges that with, they call it instant runoff voting, or it's really basically ranked choice voting. It says that there still can be, the vote total still can be manipulated by strategic voting. You basically choose who your preference is, and then you can give high marks to what you consider to be weaker candidates, and that's the manipulation. The court acknowledges that and says that a candidate who did not receive the most number of first choice votes can be elected. That's a probability that can occur when it comes to some of these instant runoff and ranked choice of voting elections. So those are a few things to think about. So the other the big quote that I take away from that Dundon case is that the court, in reviewing the constitutionality of this voting process in San Francisco, said that the instant runoff, which is ranked choice voting, also is used in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Oakland, and Berkeley. So we've all seen the news. Draw your own conclusions if that's working out well for some of those local cities.
Okay, there are several questions I'm going to try and consolidate that address voter disenfranchisement. So to some degree, there's some concern that these kinds of election reforms will in fact disenfranchise the two parties, those who are participating in the two-party system and are satisfied. And that, how could this possibly impact voter turnout for those who have been active voters in the past? So can you speak to how you see these reforms perhaps impacting the two-party system, disenfranchisement of those participants, and voter turnout in general? So we'll start with Chad.
Yes, thank you. And that's one of the things that I think should have a proper analysis under Article 1, Section 6. And that's, like I said, the Alaska Constitution provides more protection. It goes above and beyond what exists in the federal Constitution. The people have the right to assemble. There has been dissenting opinion about the role of the party in other nationwide cases. As to the analysis of the state constitution, I think that that's worthy of proper review. And I do think that there can be the opportunity potentially for confusion by the electorate when you're talking about, you might have multiple R's, multiple D's on a general election ballot ultimately, and maybe it comes down to doing your research, and that's fine. That's a fair analysis. But at the end of the day, I think that should properly be vetted before something like this gets implemented into law, not pass the law first and kind of find out what's going to happen after passage.
And Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Juanetta. Well, first of all, in terms of legality of the open primary and going to Chad's concerns, the U.S. Supreme Court spoken, 7-2 decision by Clarence Thomas Open primaries of this nature are 100% constitutional in the United States. In terms of disenfranchisement, and here I think you're talking about the 13% in the Democratic Party, the 23% in the Republican Party, they still have their power. They have their power to meet, assemble, choose, and endorse candidates. They will continue to have that power, and we've made adjustments in the law. One of the reasons it's fairly lengthy is we took some pains to preserve the structure of political parties as they exist. What they won't be able to do is artificially limit the choices of the other 64% of Alaskans. They will still have their say. They will still have their candidates. They will still have their platform. They can identify their candidates. And certainly their support is going to be very meaningful, but they can't limit the choices of everyone else. Again, through these very small parts. So, you know, half of that 23%, half of that 13%, decide who your choices are. And then finally, towards turnout, what we've seen, and particularly in light of open primaries, when open primaries enacted, primary turnout in general can go up dramatically, sometimes as much as 50%. More voters voting is always a good thing. Then your results are more democratic and more representative. And we think, you know, more people, the beautiful thing about more people voting in the primaries is they are handcuffed to the general election. Once you vote in a primary, you're showing up for the general election. We just think a little more power for the voters, more turnout, more representation. That's the opposite of disenfranchisement. We're enfranchising all Alaskans, including those in parties, because now they have more choices. I'm a member of a party and I voted for members of the other party, believe it or not. I voted for independents. And I think there are others, members of both parties, who have done the same.
Okay. Well, I wonder if you can reflect on this question then, since we did just have a primary election here and had some relatively surprising results. I think most people would characterize it as that. However, of the House seats, of the 40 House seats that were up for election, 15 were decided on filing day, and another, I think 3 or 4 were decided on primary day. And of the Senate seats, 11 Senate seats that were up, 4 were decided on filing day, and another 1 was decided on primary day. So how do you think election reform might impact those numbers? And we'll start with Chad.
Chad or Scott?
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Thank you for your help. So we're going to start with Scott on that.
Great, thank you, Juanetta. And I think what you pointed to is a huge problem. What's happened is the parties have become gatekeepers to the ballot in many ways, not only as an artifact of the closed primary system, but party structure itself. So a lot of these elections, as you point out, are decided because no one else runs. This is a strongly Democratic district, 1 Democrat filed, that's it, it's over. What happens with a ranked choice system and with an open primary system is people who say, maybe a successful business owner says, you know what, I'm tired of this, Juneau's not getting it done, I know how to run a business, I know how to balance a budget, I'm gonna run. Unless that person has an inside track with the party, they've got no path to the ballot in real sense. They could run as a petition candidate and then be the spoiler and then be blamed for the outcome of the election. In this system, those good candidates who might be out there who haven't lived their lives immersed in politics, but nonetheless have a lot to bring to us, whether they're a teacher, a doctor, a business owner, now they've got a path. Now they can say, I'm gonna jump in that race because I don't disagree with everything that person does, but I do have some disagreements and I have some ideas, by the way. So I'm gonna get in a race and may the best person win. Right now, we have a system that self-selects, and by and large, the parties attempt to exert control, not only over the people who are endorsed for the primaries, but in many non-competitive districts, essentially it's fait accompli. The election is decided by a few party insiders. That's essentially part of the problem. We're trying to break down that barrier.
All right. And now, Chad, thank you.
Yes, I'll just quote the Ninth Circuit again. It says that with ranked choice voting, instant runoffs, there still can be manipulation by strategic voting. So people can still choose to assess whatever number that they want to a candidate that may be stronger or weaker tactically. In that sense, I don't know, just from my perception as I watch things and I just review the court history around the country, I don't know that that part goes away. At least that's what the court appears to say in the prevailing authority. I do want to point out this 7-2 dissent and just talk a little bit about a quote that Scalia and Kennedy had. I do think it's important, and this goes back to the party system. It says the electorate's perception of the political party's belief is colored by its perception of those who support the party, and the party's defining act is the selection by conferring upon him the party's endorsement. When the state-printed ballot for general election causes a party to be associated with a candidate who may not fully, if at all, represent its views, it undermines both those vital aspects of political association. And when you posit that and think about the Alaska Constitution, which allows a broad-based liberty and a higher degree of political assembly and association, at least historically, it's always been interpreted as providing more protection than the federal Constitution. I think there's a compelling case that you can make the argument under Alaska law and the state constitution that the parties, just as they've stated in the weeks prior, may suffer a sort of injury because of misperceptions of who is and isn't actually associated with them. So just a few thoughts to think about.
All right, thank you. Another line of questions here has to do with the limit of 4 candidates in the general election. You know, Alaska has a long history of what I like to call fun, fringy elections, where we get random candidates that do make it to the general election. And so how would this, in fact, impact some of these smaller parties? And in fact, couldn't the duopoly of the major parties still dominate those top 4 and squeeze out the smaller parties? And we'll start with Chad on that one.
As I stated before, that there still can be manipulation and strategic voting, and people could decide to assess certain numbers depending on what they seem fit. So I think that's always going to be an issue that you're going to have to ponder. There's not going to be a perfect voting system in any capacity. There still can be that element of strategic voting to ensure that some candidates are forwarded and some candidates perhaps struggle. So I don't know that the ranked choice voting change necessarily eliminates that probability. And if history is an indicator by some of the court cases on this subject, it doesn't.
All right, and Scott?
Yeah, thank you. You know, of course, we believe that this does more than any other reform to break up the duopoly. Of course, Alaska is not a state that you could have a top 2 because our political spectrum is a bit broader and different than other states. So one of the reasons we took top 4 was it's essentially a viability test. You've got to have few enough candidates that you can have a real debate around the issues, but there has to be some threshold by which a candidate has shown, you know, I've got 15% over here. I'm viable enough to forward on to the election. And granted, that's not a problem in Alaska's elections to date, but you could imagine in a more open system, 12 people filing. While the top 4 move on, they've got viability. They're going to represent, you know, the more predominant views that have the ability to gather support. I'm a little confused by Chad's, you know, continued quoting of Dunham v. Arntz, because actually that is the Ninth Circuit case that fully approved of ranked choice voting and found it to be absolutely constitutional and consistent with one person, one vote. But there's this discussion he keeps going back to, and we've seen this from some opponents, and I have a lot of respect for Chad, so this isn't an ad hominem attack of any type, but he keeps referring to manipulation of voting. Is there some organized cabal of thousands and thousands of voters who get together and say, you vote for this person, I'll vote for that person? Because I haven't gotten my invitation. People want to vote strategically. They want to vote sincerely. They want to vote for whatever outcome they want. But every one of them's got one vote, and they've got the right to express that vote. And all we're doing is giving them a little more freedom of expression of how they vote.
All right. Well, thank you both. I want to just, we're coming up on 1 o'clock. I do want to offer all 3 of our speakers today a minute or 2 just to say some closing words. And we're going to start actually with Katherine. So Katherine, if you want to jump in for a minute or two with any closing thoughts.
Yes, thank you. In my view, as someone who looks at creating politics as healthy competition to deliver results, I want to say something. I have zero problem with two parties. I have zero problem that those parties continue to be the Republicans and the Democrats. The problem that we have is that right now the current two are guaranteed to be the only two pretty much forever, regardless of how satisfied the public is or isn't. So with healthy competition, when Republicans and Democrats do and solve problems for people, they can continue to be the ones who win. And I would also say, but if they don't, then people have another choice. So this is just about making the competition work for results. It's not about changing ideology. And again, I'll be watching you guys. Thank you.
Great. And Scott, let's go to you for.
Yeah, thank you, Annetta. And just a few thoughts in response primarily to some of Chad's thoughts. First of all, he said, you know, maybe the people want gridlock, and maybe that gridlock is in a sense good because they keep voting for these people. Well, over 60% of Alaskans think we're on the wrong track. And we've got a fiscal crisis that I think mathematically no one can deny. So I guess I would point to the evidence and the facts on that. I also want to get to his concerns, just fundamentally with the idea of direct democracy. Direct democracy is something that's been given to us in our Constitution by the founders of Alaska. Ballot measures is what I'm referring to. This is a system by which the legislators have gotten to Juneau through the current system. To expect them to change that system on themselves, not only to impact their own viability, but to draw the ire of their parties is kind of an unrealistic wish. I would point out that we would not have the Alaska Public Offices Commission right now without ballot measures. We would not have public officials required to report their financial information and their financial relationships without ballot measures. Those things wouldn't exist because the people demanded them. And he made a great point talking about Representative Gren's ethics bill. The legislature could always remove a ballot measure from the ballot by passing it. I would say the legislature had their chance. They didn't. This session, they could have passed this bill and I'd be doing something else with my time. I'd be a lot less busy. But they had their chance and they didn't. And it's up to the people to decide if they want to take that power back. The length of the ballot measure, it's written in the legislative style in order to be more transparent, to get at some of the issues people have with ballot measures, which is they say a couple things, but then they impact dozens of statutes. We haven't done that. We've been very transparent. Every statute impacted is listed. That's why it's 20-some pages long. Some of those changes we actually took from prior work by Ledge Legal. Ledge Legal worked on an open primary system. They worked on a ranked choice voting system. They went nowhere in the legislature, but we had those draft bills and we incorporated them. So a lot of the good work has already been done at the legislature. Just because of the influence of the two parties, it couldn't get over the finish line. And finally, one last thing, since Chad cited a founding father, I'd like to do so as well. John Adams, one of our early presidents, said, the greatest threat to American democracy is the dominance and control of two parties. Those parties taking choices away from the American people. And I think that's where we've come today and why ballot measure 2 is so important. Thanks.
Great. And Chad, last word, please.
And thank you, Scott and Katherine. A good, healthy debate, and I have a lot of respect for Scott. There's no doubt about it. And I would just say just a few things. As far as whether this a substantially similar language was brought to the legislature in 2020, I'm not aware. I'm Senate Majority Counsel. I'm speaking on behalf of myself today as an individual. I'm not aware if anything was ever brought to us. And I think that people should point to a look at APOC on Q3 of 2019. The campaign for this change to ranked choice voting started collecting money at that point in time. And we're talking about money. I suppose it should be pointed out that the reality is that the vast majority of the contributions, if you think about Q4 of 2019 to the second quarter of 2020, overwhelmingly, the total amount is $1,055,003.87, and $1,043,393.87 was from out of state. So, more contributions are coming in, and that's a good thing. And there are Alaska state contributions, but those in comparison are very, very little. And the vast majority of the funding is coming from Colorado, Massachusetts, and California, with these large groups that I'm not 100% clear about how they're getting their money. And so there's a couple ironic twists when it comes to dark money in this About initiative. So I just have people, my recommendation is I encourage everyone to read the entire ballot measure. Like I said, it's 25 pages long, it's 74 different sections. There's more going on than just ranked choice voting, as I alluded to. And I just ask people to ask themselves this question: is why are so many out-of-state entities spending so much money to change our state and federal election process? What's in it for them? Why are they investing so much money? So with that, like I said, Scott, good debate and great points. And Katherine, thank you for being with us, and I appreciate the dialogue.
All right, thank you, Chad. Before I turn it to Terry for final words, let me just again thank our speakers. We appreciate your time and sharing your expertise and viewpoints with us. I want to remind our audience that we do have some additional programs coming up. On September 2nd, we will be hosting a program featuring research by IHS Markit on Alaska's competitiveness as an oil and gas development zone, and we'll have some more information coming out about that very shortly. Our September program will feature representatives from our three major economic sectors: oil, fishing, and tourism. And the representatives of the three trade associations that represent those three sectors will be with us to talk about how those sectors have responded to the challenges of the COVID pandemic and what the outlook for the near future in those sectors is. Additionally, in October, we will be debating the oil tax measure, Measure 1, with representatives from One Alaska and Robin Brenna with the opposing side. And then finally, in November, we'll have food security will be our featured topic. We'll have more information about that soon. And in December, please plan again on our legislative meet and greet, where we're going to have some new legislators to speak to and hopefully orient to some of the issues that Commonwealth North has been working on. So with those upcoming programs, please keep an eye out for them and register as soon as possible. And let me turn it back to Terry for closing words. Terry?
Very good. Thank you, Juanetta. And thank you, Katherine, Scott, and Chad, for joining us today and for your presentations. We appreciate your thoughts and insights. Also, thanks for everyone that joined us online today. I encourage you to become a member if you're not. And you can get a hold of us online, and we welcome your participation and your experience again. So with that, we're adjourned. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.